Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Erik Erikson, the architect of identity across the lifespan. Together and apart, they trace the patterns of human becoming, one through the symbolic landscapes of archetype and myth, the other through the social stages where self meets world. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of human development. One seeing the eternal patterns that pull the psyche toward wholeness through symbol and shadow, the other discovering the social crucibles where identity is forged and reformed through crisis and resolution. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Erikson, as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the year 1902, when Carl Gustav Jung was a young physician walking the corridors of the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, a child was being born thousands of miles away in Frankfurt, Germany. That child, Erich Hamburger, would grow to become Erik Erikson, and though the two men would never sit across from one another in extended dialogue, their life's work would orbit similar questions about the nature of human growth, the unfolding of the self, and the patterns that guide us from birth to death. But where Jung would look inward to the timeless symbols rising from the collective unconscious, Erikson would look outward to the social world, to the communities and cultures that shape identity through predictable crises and resolutions. Both men understood that becoming who we are is not a simple matter of biological maturation, but rather a complex journey through stages, through passages, through transformations that demand something from us at every turn. Yet they mapped this journey using different compasses, different languages, different frameworks that sometimes converged and sometimes diverged, like two rivers flowing through the same landscape, but carving different channels through the stone. Jung's early years in psychiatry were marked by an intense curiosity about the hidden meanings within madness, about the symbolic language of symptoms and dreams. He had been drawn to psychiatry precisely because it seemed to bridge the material and the spiritual, the scientific and the mysterious. Under the tutelage of Eugen Bleuler at the Bergholzli, Jung developed his word association tests, those ingenious experiments where a person's delayed responses to certain words revealed emotional complexes lurking beneath conscious awareness. These complexes, Jung came to believe, were not merely personal memories or traumas, but nodes of meaning that connected to deeper, universal patterns. Even in these early days, before his fateful meeting with Sigmund Freud, before their collaboration and eventual rupture, Jung was sensing something beneath the personal psyche, something collective and ancient that spoke through symptoms and symbols. By the time Jung was in his 30s, writing his major works on psychological types and beginning his own descent into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, the child Erik was growing up in, Karlsruhe, raised by his mother and stepfather, Theodor Hamburger, a pediatrician. Erik's biological father remained unknown to him, a mystery that would haunt the man who would later become the foremost theorist of identity. Here was a boy who did not quite fit in the Jewish community where he was raised because of his tall frame and blonde hair, and who did not quite fit in the broader German society because he was Jewish. This experience of being betwixt and between, of occupying threshold spaces, would profoundly shape his thinking about identity formation. If Jung's early sense of psychological depth came from his own visions and his work with psychotic patients, Erikson's came from the everyday experience of asking, "Who am I?" when the world reflects back contradictory answers. Jung's great rupture with Freud came in 1913, and the years that followed were perhaps the most formative of his life. He withdrew from the psychoanalytic community and embarked on what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a voluntary descent into the imaginal realm, where he encountered figures, symbols, and visions that would become the foundation of his analytical psychology. He recorded these encounters in what would eventually be published as the Red Book, that extraordinary manuscript illuminated with mandalas and mythic imagery. During this period, Jung discovered what he would call archetypes, those primordial patterns of human experience that manifest across cultures and epochs. He saw the hero's journey, the divine child, the wise old man, the great mother, the shadow, the anima and animus, and ultimately the self. That archetype of wholeness toward which the psyche naturally tends. For Jung, human development was fundamentally a process of individuation, of becoming conscious of these archetypal patterns within oneself and integrating them into a coherent whole. This was not primarily a social process, but a symbolic one, a dialogue between ego and unconscious, mediated through dreams, active imagination, and the careful attention to synchronicities and symbols. While Jung was exploring the symbolic realm in Switzerland, young Erik was navigating the more immediate challenges of identity in post-World War I Germany. He studied art, traveled, and eventually found his way to Vienna in 1927, where he was invited to teach at a small school established for the children of Freud's patients and friends. This was the progressive, psychoanalytically informed school run by Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham, and it would change Erik's life. He was not trained as a psychologist or educator, but his sensitivity to children and his artistic temperament made him an effective teacher. More importantly, it brought him into the orbit of psychoanalysis at precisely the moment when Anna Freud was developing ego psychology, focusing on the defensive functions of the ego and the development of the self. Erik entered psychoanalytic training under Anna Freud herself, an unusual path for someone without a medical degree or university education. But Anna Freud recognized something in this young man, perhaps his intuitive understanding of the challenges of identity, perhaps his artistic sensibility, perhaps his own status as someone who didn't fit neatly into categories. He was analyzed by Anna Freud and received his psychoanalytic certificate in 1933, just as the shadow of Nazism was darkening over Europe. That same year, he married Joan Serson, a Canadian-American dance teacher and artist, and they fled to Denmark. Shortly after, they emigrated to America, where Erik would eventually transform himself from Erik Hamburger into Erik Erikson, taking his stepfather's first name as his new surname, a self-creation that speaks volumes about his later theories of identity. By this time, Jung was in his late 50s, an established figure who had developed his theory of psychological types, his understanding of the collective unconscious, and his map of the individuation process. His seminal work, Psychological Types, had been published in 1921, offering a systematic framework for understanding the different orientations of consciousness, introversion and extroversion, thinking and feeling, sensation and intuition. But Jung's primary focus was not on the early years of life, not on childhood development in the way that Freud and his followers emphasized. Instead, Jung became increasingly interested in the second half of life, in the psychological and spiritual crises that emerge in midlife and beyond, when questions of meaning become more pressing than questions of success. He saw the period from roughly age 35 to death as the time when individuation truly becomes possible, when the ego has been sufficiently formed that it can begin to relativize itself in relation to the self. Erikson arrived in America without English fluency, without formal credentials beyond his psychoanalytic training, and without the kind of institutional backing that would typically be required for an academic career. Yet he found his footing, first in Boston, where he worked at Massachusetts General Hospital and had a private practice, then at Yale's Institute of Human Relations, and eventually at Berkeley. Throughout these years, he was observing children, conducting psychoanalysis, and thinking deeply about the formation of identity across the lifespan. Unlike Freud, who had focused on psychosexual stages that essentially concluded with puberty, and unlike Jung, who focused on the symbolic transformations of the second half of life, Erikson began to conceive of development as a lifelong process marked by distinct psychosocial stages, each with its own crisis that must be navigated. His breakthrough came during World War II, when he was asked to study the psychological profile of Adolf Hitler for the U.S. government. This led him to think about how individual psychology intersects with cultural and historical forces, how a person's identity is shaped not just by family dynamics, but by the larger narratives and crises of their time. He also studied American Indian tribes, particularly the Sioux and the Yurok, and noticed how different child-rearing practices produced different kinds of identities, different ego strengths, different ways of being in the world. This anthropological dimension was crucial. It showed Erikson that while there might be universal stages of development, the content and resolution of each stage was profoundly shaped by culture. In 1950, Erikson published Childhood and Society, the book that would establish his reputation and introduce his 8 stages of psychosocial development. Here was a framework that spanned the entire human life cycle, from infancy to old age, with each stage presenting a fundamental crisis or tension that must be resolved to some degree before moving forward. Trust versus mistrust in infancy, autonomy versus shame and doubt in early childhood, initiative versus guilt in the play age, industry versus inferiority in school age, identity versus role confusion in adolescence, intimacy versus isolation in young adulthood, generativity versus stagnation in middle adulthood, and integrity versus despair in old age. Each stage built on the previous ones, and each presented both dangers and opportunities for growth. Now, as you rest here in the darkness, consider the profound similarity and difference in these two visions of human development. Jung, looking at the psyche through the lens of symbols and archetypes, saw development as a spiraling journey into wholeness, a gradual integration of the unconscious contents that had been projected or repressed or simply never made conscious. The stages were not primarily chronological in Jung's system, though he did emphasize the particular importance of midlife. Instead, the stages were psychological, marked by encounters with different archetypal figures and different aspects of the self. First comes the encounter with the persona, that mask we wear to meet the social world. Then the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we have disowned or denied. Then the anima or animus, the contrasexual elements within each psyche. And finally, if one persists, the self, that center of the personality that transcends and includes the ego. This was individuation, a word that meant becoming truly individual by paradoxically connecting with what is most universal and collective. Erikson, looking at the psyche through the lens of social relationships and cultural contexts, saw development as a series of crises where the individual must achieve a balance between opposing tendencies. Each stage was, indeed, chronological, tied to biological maturation and social expectations. An infant must develop basic trust in the world through consistent caregiving. A toddler must develop autonomy through exploration while not being crushed by shame when they fail. A young child must take initiative without being overwhelmed by guilt. A school-age child must develop competence without falling into feelings of inferiority. An adolescent must forge a coherent identity amid role confusion. A young adult must achieve intimacy without losing themselves in isolation. A middle-aged adult must be generative, contributing to the next generation without stagnating in self-absorption. An elder must achieve integrity, a sense that their life has had meaning without falling into despair at its approaching end. Both systems acknowledge that development is never complete, that we are always in process, always becoming. Both recognize that earlier stages profoundly influence later ones, that we carry our developmental history within us. But the mechanisms are different. Jung's individuation happens through the integration of unconscious contents made conscious through dreams, active imagination, and the careful attention to symbols. Erikson's psychosocial development happens through the resolution of social crises, through relationships with caregivers, peers, lovers, children, and communities. Jung says we must journey inward to meet the archetypes. Erikson says we must journey outward to meet the social world. Yet perhaps they are describing two sides of the same coin, two necessary dimensions of the same process of becoming human. By the 1950s, Jung was an old man, working on his final writings, reflecting on a lifetime of exploration into the psyche. He had seen 2 world wars, had witnessed the collective insanity of Nazism, had developed a deep interest in alchemy, Eastern philosophy, and the psychological meaning of religious symbols. His late works, like Answer to Job and Mystrium Conjunctionis, were dense, mystical texts that explored the relationship between consciousness and the divine, between the individual soul and the cosmic drama. He remained convinced that the psyche was not merely personal, not merely a product of biology and biography, but participated in something larger, something transpersonal and eternal. The archetypes, he believed, were not learned but inherited, not cultural constructions but primordial structures of the human mind. Erikson, in his prime during these years, was developing his ideas about identity, a concept that would become central to developmental psychology and to the broader culture. He noticed that adolescence, which earlier theorists had largely treated as a transitional phase between childhood and adulthood, was actually a crucial period for the formation of a coherent sense of self. In traditional societies, identity was largely prescribed by one's family, clan, and social role. But in modern societies, with their emphasis on individual choice and their proliferation of possible life paths, identity must be actively constructed. The adolescent must ask, "Who am I? What do I believe? What will I commit my life to?" This identity crisis, as Erikson called it, was not a pathology, but a necessary developmental challenge. Jung had also written about the search for identity, but he framed it differently. For Jung, the question was not, "Who am I?" in the sense of choosing a social role or profession, but what does the self want from me? The self, that archetype of wholeness, exerts a kind of gravitational pull on the psyche, drawing it toward its unique pattern of wholeness. This is what Jung meant by vocation, a calling that comes from within, from the depths of the psyche, rather than from social expectations or parental desires. In this sense, Jung's view might seem more mystical, more oriented toward an inner authority, while Erikson's might seem more pragmatic, more oriented toward successfully navigating the social world. But is the distinction really so clear? Both men recognized that we cannot become ourselves in isolation, that we need others to mirror us, to recognize us, to challenge us. And both recognize that there is something within us that cannot be reduced to social conditioning, some core that seeks expression. In 1958, Erikson published Young Man Luther, a psychobiographical study of Martin Luther's identity crisis and how it led to the Protestant Reformation. This work showed Erikson at his best, weaving together individual psychology, family dynamics, historical context, and cultural transformation. He argued that Luther's personal struggle with authority, guilt, and faith became the vehicle for a broader social transformation, that his identity crisis was not just personal, but also emblematic of a transitional moment in European culture. This approach, examining how individual lives intersect with historical forces, was something Jung had also practiced in his studies of historical figures like Paracelsus, or in his analysis of cultural phenomena like the rise of fascism. But where Jung looked for archetypal patterns repeating across history, Erikson looked for the specific psychosocial dynamics of a particular time and place. Here we might pause to imagine a conversation between these two men, had they ever sat down together in a quiet room, perhaps in Jung's study in Küsnacht, with its view of the lake, or in Erikson's office in Cambridge, surrounded by books and papers. What would Jung have said to Erikson's stage theory? Perhaps he would have appreciated the lifespan approach, the recognition that development continues into old age, something Jung himself had emphasized against the Freudian focus on childhood. Jung might have found in Erikson's concept of integrity versus despair in old age a parallel to his own writings on the wisdom and spiritual concerns that emerge in life's final decades. But Jung might also have gently challenged the emphasis on social adaptation, asking whether helping people adjust to their society is always psychologically healthy. After all, Jung had seen how collective consciousness could become pathological, how entire societies could fall into archetypal possession, and he believed that true individuation sometimes required standing apart from collective values. And what would Erikson have said to Jung's analytical psychology? Perhaps he would have been fascinated by the rich symbolic language, by the attention to dreams and myths, by the way Jung traced patterns across cultures and epochs. Erikson himself had studied legends and myths, particularly in his work on the identity of Jesus and Gandhi. He might have appreciated Jung's emphasis on the second half of life, on the continuing challenges of growth beyond youth. But Erikson might also have questioned whether Jung's archetypes were truly universal or whether they were themselves cultural products, shaped by the particular myths and stories that Jung had encountered. And he might have worried that Jung's inward focus could lead to a withdrawal from social responsibility, from the very engagement with community and culture that Erikson saw as essential to healthy development. Both men, we should note, were deeply concerned with the crisis of modernity, with what happens to the psyche when traditional structures of meaning break down. Jung saw this in terms of the death of God, the loss of living religious symbols, the rationalism and materialism of modern culture that left the soul impoverished. His answer was a return to the symbolic life, a re-engagement with the archetypal realm through dreams, active imagination, and the study of mythology and alchemy. He believed that without this connection to the transpersonal depths, individuals would fall into neurosis, and societies would fall into mass movements and ideologies that promised easy answers to the soul's deepest needs. Erikson saw the modern crisis in terms of identity, diffusion, the confusion that arises when there are too many choices and not enough coherent narratives to guide those choices. In traditional societies, he noted, rituals marked the transitions from one life stage to another, providing clear milestones and social recognition of developmental achievements. Modern societies often lack these rituals, leaving adolescents particularly adrift, experimenting with different identities without a clear pathway to stable adulthood. His answer was not a return to tradition, but a strengthening of the ego through meaningful relationships and social engagement, through finding communities and causes worth committing to, through the gradual building of a coherent life narrative that integrates past, present, and future. Notice how both men were offering therapeutic visions, ways of addressing the psychological suffering they saw around them. Jung's therapy aimed at individuation, at helping the patient discover their unique path and integrate their unconscious contents. This often involved long-term work with dreams, careful attention to symbols appearing in active imagination or creative work, and the gradual building of a relationship between the ego and the self. The goal was not primarily adaptation to society, but the fulfillment of one's individual destiny, becoming who one truly is rather than who one has been conditioned to be. Erikson's vision was therapeutic in a broader, more social sense. He was less focused on the consulting room, though he did practice psychoanalysis, and more interested in how societies could structure themselves to support healthy development. What kinds of families, schools, communities, and cultures best foster the progressive resolution of psychosocial crises? How can we create environments where children develop basic trust, where adolescents can explore identity without too much pressure or too much chaos, where adults find meaningful ways to be generative, where elders are honored for their wisdom rather than marginalized? These were questions of social policy as much as individual therapy. The year 1969 brought Erikson's Gandhi's Truth, a profound meditation on the life of Mohandas Gandhi and his development of nonviolent resistance. This book won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, cementing Erikson's reputation beyond psychology. In it, he explored how Gandhi's personal quest for truth and his struggle with his own aggressive impulses were transmuted into a political philosophy and strategy. Erikson coined the term militant nonviolence to describe Gandhi's approach, showing how the psychosocial concept of generativity could manifest not just in raising children, but in transforming society, in becoming a kind of father to a nation's independence movement. What would Jung have made of Gandhi? Jung had written about the dangers of inflation when an individual identifies too closely with an archetype, believing themselves to be a savior or hero rather than a human being through whom archetypal energies are constellated. Yet Jung also recognized genuine religious and moral leaders who served as vessels for the self, whose individual destinies became intertwined with collective transformation. Gandhi's fasting, his asceticism, his moral authority, These might be seen in Jungian terms as expressions of the archetype of the wise old man, or perhaps the wounded healer, someone whose own suffering becomes the source of healing for others. Jung might have been interested in Gandhi's dreams and visions, in the symbolic dimensions of his life, where Erikson focused on the psychosocial dynamics of identity and leadership. As you lie here, breathing slowly, letting these thoughts wash over you like waves, consider how both men understood that the individual and the collective are not separate, but interpenetrating. For Jung, the collective manifests through the individual in the form of archetypal experiences and dreams. The collective unconscious is not somewhere else, but is the deepest layer of each person's psyche. When we individuate, we do not leave the collective behind, but rather connect with it more consciously, taking our place as a unique expression of universal patterns. For Erikson, the collective manifests through the individual in the form of culture, language, social roles, and historical context. Identity is always psychosocial, always a negotiation between inner experience and outer expectations. When we develop a strong identity, we do not leave society behind, but rather find our unique way of contributing to it, our particular place in the social fabric. Let us descend deeper now into the specific concepts that define each man's psychology, comparing them side by side, listening for resonances and dissonances. Begin with Jung's concept of the self, that archetype of wholeness and totality that represents the goal of individuation. The self is both the center and the circumference of the psyche, both the organizing principle from birth and the realized unity at the end of the individuation process. It is paradoxical, greater than the ego yet including it, transcendent yet immanent, experienced as both deeply personal and utterly transpersonal. Jung saw the self symbolized in mandalas, those circular designs that appear spontaneously in the dreams and artwork of people undergoing deep psychological transformation. He saw it in religious symbols like the Christ figure or the Buddha, in alchemical images of the philosopher's stone, in the quaternity, in anything that represents wholeness, balance, and integration. The self has a kind of intelligence, a teleological pull toward wholeness. It orchestrates dreams, arranges synchronicities, and sends symptoms when we stray too far from our path. In Jung's view, neurosis often arises when the ego is too rigid, too identified with the persona, too cut off from the deeper currents of the self. The cure is not strengthening the ego's defenses, as classical psychoanalysis might suggest, but rather opening to dialogue with the unconscious, allowing the self to guide the process of transformation. The ego does not disappear, but finds its rightful place in relation to the larger psyche, learning to listen and respond rather than dominate and control. Now compare this with Erikson's concept of ego identity. For Erikson, identity is the sense of continuity and sameness that links one's experience of oneself across time and across different social contexts. It is what allows you to feel that you are the same person you were as a child, that you will be tomorrow as you are today, that you remain yourself whether you are at work or at home or among strangers. Identity in Erikson's sense is not purely internal, not a matter of discovering some essential self, but is co-created through social interactions. We come to know who we are by seeing ourselves reflected in the eyes of others, by taking on roles and responsibilities, by committing to values and goals. Erikson spoke of ego strength, the resilience and vitality that comes from successfully navigating each psychosocial crisis. Each stage, if resolved positively, adds a new strength or virtue to the personality. Trust yields hope, autonomy yields will, initiative yields purpose, industry yields competence, identity yields fidelity, intimacy yields love, generativity yields care, and integrity yields wisdom. These strengths are not absolute achievements, but rather the dominant tendency that emerges from each crisis. No one resolves any crisis completely. We all carry some mistrust, some shame, some guilt, some sense of inadequacy. But if the balance tips toward the positive pole more than the negative, the ego is strengthened and able to meet the challenges of the next stage. Here we see a fundamental difference. Jung's self is transpersonal, archetypal, connected to the collective unconscious and to what Jung sometimes called the objective psyche. It is discovered rather than constructed, revealed rather than chosen. The process of individuation is one of uncovering and integrating what has always been there in potential. Erikson's ego identity is more constructed, more contingent on social interactions and historical context. It is built through choices, commitments, and relationships. The process of identity formation is one of actively creating a coherent narrative that links past experiences with future possibilities. Yet both concepts address the question of what holds the personality together, what gives life meaning and direction. Jung's self provides meaning through connection to archetypal patterns, through participation in the eternal dramas of human existence. To discover one's myth, one's unique expression of universal themes, is to find meaning. Erikson's identity provides meaning through coherence, through the sense that one's life makes sense, that there is continuity between what one has been and what one is becoming. To forge a strong identity, to know who you are and what you stand for, is to find meaning. Consider now Jung's map of psychological development, which is less linear than Erikson's stages. Jung spoke of the first half of life and the second half of life, with a transition around midlife being particularly significant. In the first half of life, the task is to develop the ego, to establish oneself in the world, to build a career and family, to strengthen one's conscious personality. During this phase, we are naturally extroverted in a psychological sense, oriented toward outer achievements and social adaptation. We develop a strong persona, learning to play the roles that society expects of us. We repress or project our shadow, those aspects of ourselves that don't fit our idealized self-image. This is all normal and necessary, Jung believed. The ego must be strong before it can be relativized. But around midlife, often precipitated by crisis, loss, or simply a growing sense of emptiness, a shift begins. The values and goals that motivated the first half of life start to lose their luster. Success in the world no longer feels sufficient. There arises a longing for something more, something deeper, something that connects to meaning rather than just achievement. This is the call to individuation, the invitation to turn inward, to explore the unconscious, to integrate the shadow and encounter the anima or animus. In the second half of life, the task is not to build the ego but to discover the self, not to conquer the world but to understand one's place in the larger pattern of existence. This often involves a turn toward introversion, toward reflection and contemplation, toward spirituality and philosophy. Jung saw this midlife transition as crucial, a hinge point where life either deepens or stagnates. Many people, he noticed, try to continue living according to the values of the first half of life, clinging to youth seeking new conquests, refusing to look inward. This refusal leads to neurosis, to a sense of meaninglessness, to what we might now call a midlife crisis in the pathological sense. But those who accept the call to individuation, who have the courage to confront their unconscious, enter a profound process of transformation that can continue until death. Now consider how Erikson's stages both parallel and diverge from this map. Erikson gives us 8 stages instead of 2 halves, providing more granularity, more attention to the specific challenges of each phase of life. His stages are psychosocial, meaning they arise from the interaction between biological maturation and social expectations. A baby does not choose when to develop trust. It happens in the first year of life, because that is when the infant is utterly dependent on caregivers. An adolescent does not choose when to face identity questions. It happens in the teenage years because that is when society begins to ask, what will you be? What will you commit to? Yet we can see echoes of Jung's 2 halves in Erikson's framework. The first 4 or 5 stages of Erikson's model, from infancy through adolescence, correspond roughly to Jung's first half of life. They are about building the ego, developing competencies, forging an identity, preparing to take one's place in the adult world. The later stages, intimacy, generativity, and integrity, correspond more to Jung's second half of life, though they are framed in social rather than symbolic terms. Intimacy is about forming deep relationships. Generativity is about contributing to the next generation or to society more broadly, and integrity is about achieving a sense of wholeness and acceptance regarding one's life as it has been lived. Erikson's midlife stage, generativity versus stagnation, is particularly interesting to compare with Jung's midlife transition. For Erikson, the crisis of middle adulthood is about whether one remains productively engaged with life, contributing to others, or whether one stagnates in self-absorption and boredom. Generativity can mean having and raising children, but it can also mean mentoring younger colleagues, creating works of art or scholarship, engaging in community service, or contributing to social causes. The key is that one's energy flows outward toward the future, toward creating and caring for what will outlive the self. Jung would likely have appreciated this concept, seeing in it a social manifestation of what he described in more symbolic terms. Jung spoke of the need in midlife to become a teacher or guide for others, to share the wisdom gained from one's own encounter with the unconscious. He wrote about the importance of confronting one's mortality, of accepting one's limitations, of finding meaning not in ego achievements but in connection to something greater. This sounds very much like generativity, though Jung would have added the dimension of symbolic transformation, the inner work with dreams and archetypes that accompanies the outer work of contributing to the world. Erikson's final stage, integrity, versus despair, finds perhaps its closest parallel in Jung's late writings on the psychology of aging. Both men recognize that old age brings its own developmental challenges, its own opportunities for growth. For Erikson, the task is to review one's life and find a sense of integrity, a feeling that one's life, with all its choices and chances, has been meaningful and worthwhile. Those who cannot achieve this sense of integrity fall into despair, into bitterness about roads not taken, into fear of death. Integrity involves accepting one's one and only life cycle as something that had to be, finding meaning in the whole pattern, including the mistakes and losses. Jung wrote about the wisdom that can come in old age, the perspective that allows one to see one's life as a whole, as a story with its own inner logic and meaning. He spoke of the natural turn towards spirituality in life's final decades, the growing concern with questions of ultimate meaning, the preparation for death not as an ending but as a transformation. Jung believed that the psyche naturally begins to loosen its attachment to the ego in old age, preparing for whatever comes after. He was interested in the archetypal dimension of death, in the symbols of rebirth and transformation that appear in the dreams of the dying. This mystical dimension goes beyond Erikson's more pragmatic focus on life review and acceptance, yet both men are pointing toward a similar developmental achievement, the ability to say yes to one's life as it has been, to accept death as part of life's pattern. Let us turn now to the question of identity, that concept so central to Erikson's work. Erikson defined identity formation as the major task of adolescence, though he emphasized that it continues to be refined and revised throughout life. The adolescent must integrate the identifications and roles of childhood into a coherent sense of self that can bridge past and future. This involves exploring different possible identities, trying on different roles, ideologies, and relationships. In traditional societies, Erikson noted, this exploration was brief and highly structured. A boy would follow his father's occupation, would marry according to family arrangements, would inherit his social position. But in modern societies, the choices proliferate and the exploration extends, sometimes well into the 20s or even 30s. Erikson spoke of identity crisis not as a pathology, but as a normative challenge of adolescence and young adulthood. Some confusion, some experimentation, some anxiety about who one is and will become is natural and necessary. The danger comes when this crisis is prolonged, when the young person cannot commit to any path, cannot form a stable identity. This is what Erikson called identity diffusion, a state of chronic uncertainty and role confusion. The other danger is premature identity foreclosure, when a young person commits to an identity without sufficient exploration, often simply adopting parental expectations without question. This may provide short-term stability, but often leads to later crises when the foreclosed identity no longer fits. What would Jung have said about identity crisis? He might have seen in it an encounter with the persona, that social mask we wear to meet the world. The adolescent is trying to figure out which persona to adopt, which role to play, which mask fits. But Jung would likely have cautioned that no persona, however carefully chosen, can substitute for the deeper work of individuation. One can have a strong identity in Erikson's sense, a clear sense of who one is socially, and still be far from individuation, still be cut off from the unconscious, still be living an unlived life. The socially adapted person may be neurotic in Jung's sense if they have sacrificed their unique potential to fit societal expectations. Yet Jung also recognized the importance of social adaptation, particularly in the first half of life. One cannot individuate from nowhere. One needs a developed ego, a functional persona, the ability to navigate the social world. In this sense, Erikson's identity formation might be seen as a necessary foundation for later individuation. The adolescent, who successfully forges an identity, has developed ego strength, has learned to make commitments, has connected their inner experience with outer roles. This provides a stable platform from which the deeper work of individuation can later proceed. Erikson's concept of fidelity, the virtue that emerges from successfully resolved identity crisis, is illuminating here. Fidelity means the ability to sustain loyalties freely pledged, to commit to values, ideologies, and relationships, even when doing so is difficult. It is the psychological foundation for integrity, for keeping promises to oneself and others. Jung would surely have appreciated this, seeing in fidelity a form of commitment to one's path, to one's vocation in the deeper sense. To individuate requires fidelity to the self's promptings, the courage to remain loyal to one's inner truth, even when it conflicts with outer expectations. Consider now the question of culture and its role in psychological development. Here, the differences between Jung and Erikson become particularly pronounced. Jung believed in a collective unconscious that is universal, the same in all human beings, regardless of culture or history. The archetypes are inherited structures of the psyche, like the inherited structures of the body. Just as all humans have hearts and lungs, all humans have the hero archetype, the mother archetype, the shadow, and so forth. Culture, in Jung's view, provides the specific images and stories through which these universal archetypes are expressed, but it does not create them. The hero's journey appears in myths around the world not because of cultural diffusion, but because it reflects an archetypal pattern in the human psyche. Erikson, influenced by anthropology and his own fieldwork with Native American tribes, saw culture as far more fundamental to psychology. His stages are psychosocial, meaning they arise from the interaction between biological maturation and social expectations, and those social expectations vary dramatically across cultures. The specific crises of each stage, the ways those crises are resolved, the virtues that emerge, all are shaped by culture. A Sioux child developing autonomy does so in a very different context than a middle-class American child, with different practices around feeding, toilet training, exploration, and discipline. These differences produce different kinds of identities, different ego strengths, different ways of being in the world. For Erikson, there was no development without culture, no way to understand the psyche apart from its social embedding. He would likely have been skeptical of Jung's universal archetypes, seeing them as generalizations that obscure the rich diversity of human psychological development across cultures. Yet Erikson did believe in certain universal stages, suggesting that all human societies must address similar developmental challenges even if they do so in different ways. All cultures must help infants develop trust, must guide toddlers toward autonomy, must provide frameworks for identity formation in adolescence, must support generativity in adulthood. In this limited sense, Erikson's stages have a quasi-universal quality, though their content is always culturally specific. Jung might respond that Erikson's cultural relativism misses the deeper patterns that unite humanity. Yes, cultures differ in their surface features, in their specific practices and beliefs, but beneath this diversity are common structures of meaning, common symbols, common psychological challenges. The mandala appears in Tibetan Buddhism, in Christian rose windows, in Navajo sand paintings, in the spontaneous drawings of people who have never seen any of these traditions. This cannot be explained by cultural diffusion or conscious learning, Jung would argue. It points to something deeper, to an archetypal pattern of wholeness that emerges from the psyche itself. Yet perhaps these two views are not entirely incompatible. Perhaps the archetypes provide a deep structure, a set of potentials and patterns that must be activated and shaped by culture. The mother archetype is universal, but actual mothers are culturally specific, and the relationship between the two, the archetype and its cultural manifestation, shapes psychological development. Erikson's psychosocial stages might describe the normative path of ego development within a given culture, while Jung's individuation describes the deeper process of integrating unconscious contents that goes beyond social adaptation. Both levels are real, both are important, and a complete psychology must account for both. Let us explore now the methods each man used in their work. For these methods reveal their underlying assumptions about the psyche. Jung's primary method was what he called analytical psychology, a form of depth psychology that worked primarily with dreams, active imagination, and the analysis of symbolic material. In a typical Jungian analysis, the patient would bring dreams, and Jung would work with these dreams not just to uncover repressed memories or wishes, but to listen to what the unconscious was trying to communicate. Dreams in Jung's view are not primarily disguises or censors, but rather direct messages from the unconscious, often compensating for the one-sidedness of conscious attitudes. Jung also used active imagination, a technique where the patient enters a meditative state and engages in dialogue with figures that emerge from the unconscious. These might be dream characters, or they might arise spontaneously as inner personalities with their own voices and perspectives. Jung believed that these figures are relatively autonomous complexes or archetypal images, and by dialoguing with them, integrating their messages, the patient gradually integrates unconscious contents and moves toward individuation. This was a creative, imaginative process, more akin to art or meditation than to scientific analysis. Jung was also deeply interested in patients' drawings, paintings, and other creative work. He himself painted and sculpted, particularly during his confrontation with the unconscious, and he encouraged patients to do the same. Art, he believed, allows unconscious contents to emerge in symbolic form, bypassing the rational ego's censorship. The mandalas that patients spontaneously created were particularly important to Jung, as they indicated a natural movement toward wholeness and integration. Erikson's methods were quite different, reflecting his psychoanalytic training but also his anthropological interests. He conducted traditional psychoanalysis, working with patients over many sessions to explore childhood experiences, family dynamics, and unconscious conflicts. But he also conducted what he called psychohistorical studies, biographical analyses of significant historical figures like Martin Luther and Gandhi. These studies combined psychoanalytic insight with historical research, trying to understand how individual psychology intersects with historical context. Erikson looked at childhood experiences, yes, but also at the social and cultural forces that shaped a person's identity and life choices. Erikson also conducted anthropological fieldwork, observing child-rearing practices and cultural rituals in different societies. This gave him a comparative perspective, allowing him to see which aspects of development were universal and which were culturally specific. He paid attention to the social institutions that support development at each stage, from family to school to workplace to religious and civic organizations. His approach was more observational, more sociological, less focused on the symbolic and imaginal realms that fascinated Jung. In their therapeutic goals, we see another interesting parallel and divergence. Jung's goal was individuation, becoming who you truly are, by integrating unconscious contents and discovering your unique myth. This was not primarily about adaptation to society, though Jung recognized that a certain degree of adaptation was necessary and healthy. But individuation might sometimes require standing apart from collective values, refusing to identify with cultural norms, following an inner truth even when it conflicts with outer expectations. Jung's ideal was the individuated person who has integrated the shadow, made conscious the projections of anima or animus, achieved a relationship with a self, and lives creatively from their own center rather than from borrowed collective attitudes. Erikson's goal was more clearly about healthy adaptation, though not in a conformist sense. He wanted to help people achieve ego strength, the ability to navigate the psychosocial crises of each life stage successfully. This meant developing trust, autonomy, initiative, competence, identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity. A healthy person in Erikson's view is one who has a strong ego identity, who can form intimate relationships, who contributes to the next generation, who finds meaning in their life story. This is social in a way that Jung's individuation is not. It requires connection, engagement, participation in community and culture. Yet both men believed in growth as a lifelong process, in development that continues until death. Both rejected the idea that personality is fixed in childhood, that therapy merely undoes childhood damage to restore normal functioning. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to create new symbols and new attitudes that transcend the conflict between conscious and unconscious. Erikson spoke of the epigenetic principle, the idea that each stage of development emerges from and builds upon previous stages, but that growth at any stage can retroactively transform earlier stages. Both saw the psyche as dynamic, creative, capable of transformation at any age. As you rest here, breathing softly, let these ideas settle like snow, each one distinct yet part of a larger pattern. Both Jung and Erikson were mapping the same territory, the territory of human development, but they were drawing different maps, emphasizing different landmarks, using different languages. Jung's map is filled with symbols, archetypes, dreams, visions, the numinous encounters with the unconscious. Erikson's map is filled with social relationships, cultural contexts, developmental crises, ego strengths. Jung's map tends toward the mystical, the transpersonal, the eternal. Erikson's map tends toward the pragmatic, the relational, the historical. We must also consider their different relationships to Freud, for Freud casts a long shadow over both men's work. Jung was Freud's chosen heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis, before their dramatic rupture in 1913. That rupture came from fundamental differences, particularly Jung's insistence that the unconscious was not just personal but collective, not just repressed sexuality but a vast archetypal realm with its own creative and spiritual dynamics. Freud saw this as mysticism, as a betrayal of psychoanalysis's scientific foundations. Jung saw Freud's reductionism, his emphasis on sexuality and childhood trauma, as impoverishing, as missing the soul's deeper dimensions. Erikson came to psychoanalysis a generation later, trained by Freud's daughter Anna, and he remained a psychoanalyst throughout his career even as he extended psychoanalytic theory in new directions. His stages built on Freud's psychosexual stages but transcended them, moving beyond the focus on libidinal zones to encompass the full range of psychosocial challenges across the lifespan. Erikson accepted Freud's basic insights about the unconscious, about the formative power of early childhood, about the importance of defense mechanisms, but he added dimensions that Freud had neglected: the social context, cultural differences, the full span of development from birth to death. In some ways, Erikson's ego psychology represents a middle path between Freud's emphasis on instincts and the id, and Jung's emphasis on archetypes and the self. Erikson focused on the ego, on its development, its strengths, its capacity for adaptation and synthesis. But unlike classical psychoanalysis, which saw the ego primarily as defending against instinctual drives, Erikson saw the ego as having its own energies, its own drive toward competence and mastery. And unlike Jung, who relativized the ego in relation to the self, Erikson made the ego central, the integrating function that achieves identity and maintains it across the lifespan. Jung would perhaps see Erikson's ego psychology as remaining too close to the surface, too focused on adaptation, not penetrating deeply enough into the archetypal realm. The ego, in Jung's view, is necessary but not sufficient. It must be strong enough to withstand the encounter with the unconscious, but it must also be flexible enough to relativize itself, to recognize that it is not the center of the personality, that the self is the true center. An overstrong ego, identified with the persona and its achievements, is as much a problem as a weak ego. The goal is not ego strength per se, but ego self-axis, a functional relationship between conscious and unconscious. Erikson might respond that Jung's mysticism risks losing contact with the concrete realities of life, with the actual challenges of living in society, forming relationships, earning a living, raising children. The self may be an inspiring idea, but most people struggle with more mundane questions of identity and role, of how to be both themselves and part of something larger. Erikson's stages provide a practical framework for understanding and supporting these struggles, a framework that therapists, educators, parents, and policymakers can actually use. Let us examine more closely now the question of adolescence, for this is where Erikson made perhaps his most distinctive contribution. Before Erikson, psychoanalytic theory had relatively little to say about adolescence. Freud saw it primarily as the genital stage, the culmination of psychosexual development when the sexual instincts fully mature and find appropriate objects. Anna Freud wrote about the defensive struggles of adolescence, the ways teenagers cope with the upsurge of instinctual drives. But Erikson saw adolescence as much more than hormonal upheaval or defensive maneuvering. He saw it as the crucial period for identity formation, for answering the question, who am I? The adolescent, in Erikson's view, must integrate all the identifications of childhood into a coherent sense of self. The child has identified with parents, teachers, heroes, friends, and now must somehow synthesize these identifications with their own emerging sense of their unique qualities and possibilities. They must also connect past and future, must see themselves as having a history that leads somewhere, a trajectory that makes sense. This is not just a cognitive task, but an emotional and social one. The adolescent needs to feel recognized by others, to see themselves reflected back as a coherent person, to find groups and communities where they belong. Erikson introduced the concept of the psychosocial moratorium, a period in late adolescence or early adulthood when society allows, even encourages, experimentation and exploration before demanding firm commitments. College, travel, military service, artistic pursuits, these can all serve as moratoriums, protected spaces where identity can be tried out and revised without permanent consequences. Modern societies tend to have longer moratoriums than traditional ones, reflecting both the complexity of modern life and the prolonged dependence of young people on their families and institutions. Jung wrote less specifically about adolescence, but his theory of psychological types might be seen as relevant to identity formation. The adolescent is discovering their type, whether they are introverted or extroverted, whether their dominant function is thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition. This process of discovering one's type is part of discovering who one is, what comes naturally, where one's strengths and weaknesses lie. Jung believed that the first half of life should involve developing one's superior function, the natural strength, and that only later does one need to develop the inferior function, the weakest aspect. This suggests that adolescent identity formation should honor the young person's natural type rather than forcing them into a mold that doesn't fit. Yet Jung might also caution that identifying too strongly with one's type can, to be limiting, a kind of premature identity foreclosure in Erikson's terms. The introverted thinking type who defines their entire identity around intellectual achievement may neglect feeling, relationship, and the inner life. Part of individuation involves eventually developing the inferior function, becoming more whole by integrating what has been left out. So identity formation and individuation are related but not identical. The first gives coherence and direction. The second brings wholeness and depth. Erikson noticed that identity crises become more common and more severe in times of rapid social change, when traditional values are questioned and new possibilities emerge. The 1960s, during which Erikson was writing extensively on identity, was precisely such a time. Young people questioned parental values, experimented with alternative lifestyles, protested against war and injustice. Erikson saw in these upheavals both dangers and opportunities. Dangers of identity, diffusion, and cynicism, but also opportunities for authentic identity formation based on genuine commitment rather than passive conformity. Jung, too, was deeply concerned with the spiritual and psychological crisis of modernity. He saw in the youth movements of his time, including the deeply troubling mass movements of fascism and communism, expressions of archetypal energies that had broken free from their traditional containers. When living religious symbols die, when cultures lose their myths and rituals, the archetypes don't disappear, but rather erupt in destructive forms. The Hitler Youth, for instance, might be seen as a collective possession by the hero archetype, channeled into pathological nationalism and aggression. Jung's hope was that individuals could relate to these archetypal energies consciously through analysis and symbolic work, rather than being swept up in collective movements. Both men, then, saw adolescence and young adulthood as a vulnerable period, a time when powerful energies seek expression and must be channeled constructively. Erikson focused on the formation of a coherent identity through exploration and commitment. Jung focused on the development of the ego and persona in preparation for later individuation. Both recognized that this period sets the trajectory for much of the rest of life. Consider now the question of intimacy, Erikson's sixth stage, which follows identity formation. Young adults who have achieved a strong identity are now capable of true intimacy, of fusing their identity with another's in friendship or love without fear of losing themselves. Intimacy requires both the strength to maintain one's identity and the flexibility to merge, to truly share oneself with another. Those who fear such fusion, who remain isolated behind their defenses, fail to achieve intimacy and remain isolated even when in relationships. Jung approached relationship quite differently through the concept of projection and the archetypal images of anima and animus. In Jung's view, we initially encounter the opposite sex through projections of our own contrasexual soul image. A man projects his anima, his inner feminine, onto a woman, and falls in love with his own projection. A woman projects her animus, her inner masculine, onto a man. These projections are necessary and natural in the beginning. They create the fascination and energy of romantic love. But mature relationship requires gradually withdrawing these projections, recognizing the other person as they actually are, rather than as a carrier of one's own unconscious contents. Integrating the anima or animus is a major task of individuation, typically belonging to the second half of life. It means recognizing and developing the contrasexual qualities within oneself, the feeling and intuition in a thinking-type man, the thinking and assertion in a feeling-type woman. When these contrasexual aspects are integrated, relationship becomes less about projection and more about true encounter between two individuals who are becoming whole. Erikson's intimacy and Jung's withdrawal of projections might be seen as describing similar processes from different angles. Intimacy requires knowing oneself well enough to share truly, which means having achieved identity in Erikson's sense. It also requires seeing the other clearly, which means withdrawing projections in Jung's sense. Both men understood that mature love is different from romantic infatuation, that it requires psychological development and self-knowledge. Yet there is a difference in emphasis. Erikson's intimacy is fundamentally about connection, about the capacity to care deeply for another and to share one's life with them. The virtue that emerges from this stage is love, the ability to commit to another despite differences and conflicts. Jung's approach might seem more individualistic, more focused on inner work and integration. But Jung also wrote beautifully about relationship, about the mysterious conjunctio, or union of opposites that occurs in mature love, about how relationship can be a vessel for individuation when both partners are committed to their own and each other's development. Moving forward through Erikson's stages, we come to generativity versus stagnation, the crisis of middle adulthood. This is the stage most directly comparable to Jung's midlife transition, though framed very differently. For Erikson, generativity means establishing and guiding the next generation, whether through raising children, mentoring, teaching, creative work, or social engagement. The generative person is productive and caring, contributing to the continuity of society and culture. The stagnant person, by contrast, becomes self-absorbed, pseudo-intimate, treating themselves as their own child, not growing beyond themselves. Jung's midlife transition is more focused on inner transformation than outer contribution, though the two are not mutually exclusive. At midlife, Jung believed, the psyche naturally begins to shift its orientation from outer achievement to inner meaning. The persona and ego that have been built up in the first half of life start to feel confining. Repressed aspects of the personality, especially the shadow and the contrasexual anima or animus, begin to demand attention. Dreams become more intense, often featuring compensatory symbols that challenge conscious attitudes. Some people experience this as a full-blown crisis, others as a gradual shift in values and interests. The danger Jung saw in midlife was clinging to the attitudes of youth, trying to remain the conquering hero, the successful professional, the attractive lover. This leads to rigidity, depression, and what Jung called an infantile attitude toward life. The opportunity is to embrace the call to individuation, to turn inward, to explore the symbolic realm, to find meaning beyond social roles and achievements. Those who accept this call often become more introverted, more reflective, more interested in spiritual and philosophical questions. They may also become, paradoxically, more creative and productive, but from a different source, no longer driven by ego ambition, but by a sense of vocation from the self. Erikson's generativity overlaps with this in interesting ways. The generative person is not just maintaining their youthful productivity, but shifting toward caring for others, toward contributing to something beyond themselves. This sounds like what Jung described as the natural shift from ego-centeredness to a broader perspective that includes the collective, the future, the whole. Erikson wrote about the importance of being needed, of having others depend on you as a source of vitality in midlife. Jung might see this social need as the outer manifestation of an inner call from the self to become more conscious, more integrated, more whole, so as to have something worth transmitting to the next generation. Both men recognized that midlife brings an increased awareness of mortality, of time running out, of the need to make one's life count for something. Erikson framed this in terms of generativity, the desire to leave something behind, to be remembered, to contribute to the future. Jung framed it in terms of individuation, the urgency to become who you truly are before it's too late. Perhaps these are two descriptions of the same fundamental shift, a movement beyond the ego's narrow concerns towards something larger and more enduring. We arrive finally at Erikson's 8th stage, integrity versus despair, and Jung's writings on the psychology of old age and death. For Erikson, integrity is the acceptance of one's life as it has been, the recognition that one's life cycle is complete and has meaning. It involves integrating the earlier stages, seeing how each crisis contributed to the whole, accepting even the failures and losses as part of the pattern. The person with integrity does not wish to relive their life differently, does not regret the choices made, but accepts the life they have lived as their own. This brings a sense of peace, even wisdom, and makes it possible to face death without despair. Despair, the negative pole of this stage, arises when one cannot accept one's life, when there is bitterness about missed opportunities, resentment about the cards one was dealt, fear that there is not enough time left to start over. The despairing person feels their life has been meaningless, wasted, or lived according to false values. This makes death terrifying, the ultimate defeat rather than the natural completion of the life cycle. Jung's approach to aging and death was more explicitly spiritual and philosophical. He wrote about how the psyche in old age naturally begins to prepare for death, how dreams often contain symbols of transformation and transcendence. Jung believed that death is not simply an ending, but a transformation, a return to the unconscious from which we came. The archetype of death and rebirth, which appears in all religious traditions, points to this psychological reality. The individuated person approaches death not with fear but with a sense of completion, having lived their myth and integrated their shadow, having established a relationship with the self that transcends ego identity. Jung was fascinated by near-death experiences, by religious visions of the afterlife, by the ways that different cultures prepare for and understand death. He remained agnostic about literal survival after death, but insisted that the psyche behaves as if death is not an absolute end, but a transition. This psychological fact, this natural orientation of the psyche toward continuity beyond death, has important implications for how we live. If we live in denial of death, we live inauthentically, missing the urgency and preciousness of life. But if we accept death as part of the life cycle, we can live more fully, more consciously, more attuned to what truly matters. Erikson's integrity and Jung's preparation for death are clearly related. Both involve a life review, a making sense of the whole journey. Both require accepting limitations, accepting the unlived lives, accepting that one's particular life cycle, not some ideal or imagined alternative, is what one has. Both see this acceptance as bringing a kind of wisdom, the wisdom of the ages in Erikson's language, the wisdom of the senex or old man archetype in Jung's. Yet Jung adds dimensions that go beyond Erikson's framework. Jung sees old age as potentially the most spiritual time of life, when questions of ultimate meaning become central, when the proximity of death focuses the mind on essentials. He writes about how the self becomes more apparent in old age, how dreams and synchronicities may increase, how some people have visions or experiences of the numinous. This is not about social integration or ego strength, but about the relationship between ego and self, about preparing the psyche for its dissolution or transformation. Throughout their work, both men showed profound respect for the full human lifespan, refusing to see development as ending in childhood or even young adulthood. Both insisted that we continue to grow, to change, to face new challenges until we die. This was a revolutionary view at the time, countering the prevailing assumption that personality is fixed by early childhood. Both men saw therapeutic potential throughout life, the possibility of healing old wounds, of developing new capacities, of transforming in fundamental ways even in old age. Imagine, as you drift closer to sleep, these two men sitting in conversation, perhaps walking together along a lakeshore, discussing the patterns of human life. Erikson might sketch out his 8 stages, showing Jung how each builds on the previous one, how each presents its characteristic crisis and virtue. Jung might nod in recognition, seeing parallels to his own observations, but then he might gently lead Erikson to consider the symbolic dimension, the way archetypes constellate at different life stages, the importance of dreams and synchronicities as guides through these passages. Erikson might challenge Jung to consider the cultural specificity of these symbolic patterns, the way that social context shapes what seem to be universal experiences. Jung might challenge Erikson to look beneath social adaptation to the deeper, transpersonal dimensions of the psyche. They would likely find much to agree about. Both saw development as driven by crisis and tension, by the need to balance opposites. For Jung, it was the tension between conscious and unconscious, ego and self, persona and shadow. For Erikson, it was the tension between the two poles of each psychosocial crisis, trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, and so on. Both believe that health comes not from eliminating one pole in favor of the other, but from achieving a dynamic balance, a creative tension that generates growth. Both saw this process as natural, as built into the psyche itself, as guided by inherent patterns and potentials. They would also likely find points of creative disagreement. Erikson might worry that Jung's focus on the inner world could lead to neglect of social responsibility, to a kind of spiritual narcissism. Jung might worry that Erikson's focus on social adaptation could lead to conformity, to the suppression of individuality in favor of collective values. Erikson emphasized continuity of identity across the lifespan, while Jung emphasized transformation, even discontinuity, as the ego relativizes itself in relation to the self. Erikson's vision is more coherent, more integrated, emphasizing narrative continuity and ego strength. Jung's vision is more paradoxical, more willing to embrace discontinuity and fragmentation as necessary parts of the individuation process. Perhaps the deepest difference lies in their view of what constitutes psychological health and maturity. For Erikson, the healthy person is one who has successfully navigated the psychosocial crises of each stage, emerging with hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, care, and wisdom. Such a person has a strong ego identity, can form intimate relationships, contributes to society, and accepts their life as meaningful. This is a social vision of health, emphasizing adaptation, relationship, and contribution. For Jung, the mature person is one who has individuated, who has become conscious of their archetypal patterns, who has integrated shadow and anima or animus, who has established a relationship with the self. Such a person is authentic, living from their own center rather than from borrowed collective attitudes. They are creative, producing work that expresses their unique perspective. They are wise, seeing through the illusions of ego and persona to the deeper patterns beneath. This is a more mystical vision of health, emphasizing authenticity, consciousness, and symbolic realization. Yet these need not be mutually exclusive. Perhaps the most complete vision of human development would integrate both perspectives, acknowledging that we need both ego strength and self-realization, both social adaptation and individual authenticity, both the skills to navigate our culture and the depth to transcend its limitations. We need Erikson's stages to understand the normative path of development through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. We need Jung's individuation to understand the unique path each person must walk, the symbolic journey that cannot be reduced to social roles and achievements. Consider the person who has achieved Erikson's final stage of integrity, accepting their life with its choices and chances, facing death without despair. If such a person has also individuated in Jung's sense, accepting their shadow, integrating their contrasexual aspects, living in conscious relationship with the self, then we have a truly whole person, someone who is both fully human in the social sense and fully individuated in the spiritual sense. This would be someone who has walked both paths, the outer path of psychosocial development and the inner path of symbolic transformation, and found them to be, ultimately, one path viewed from different angles. As you rest here in the borderland between waking and sleeping, let us reflect more broadly on what these two visions reveal about the nature of human consciousness and development. Both Jung and Erikson were responding to the crisis of modernity, to the loss of traditional structures of meaning and identity. Both were trying to map new territories of the psyche that had been revealed by the breakdown of traditional certainties. But they mapped these territories differently, using different landmarks and different languages. Jung turned inward, into the depths of the unconscious, finding there a source of meaning and guidance that did not depend on external authority or social consensus, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the self. These provided an inner compass that could orient a person even when outer structures had collapsed. Jung's vision was deeply individualistic in the sense that it emphasized each person's unique path, their particular myth, their individual relationship with the unconscious. Yet it was also profoundly universal, finding in the psyche's depths patterns that connect all humans across time and culture. Erikson turned outward, into the social world, but with a deep understanding of how social structures interact with individual development. He showed how culture provides the scaffolding for development, the rituals and institutions and expectations that guide us through life's passages. Erikson's vision was social in the sense that it emphasized our embeddedness in relationships and communities, our need for recognition and belonging. Yet it was also profoundly psychological, showing how these social structures become internalized, how they shape identity and ego strength from within. Both men understood that modernity presents particular challenges. Traditional societies provided clear pathways through life, rituals to mark transitions, myths to give meaning to suffering, roles that gave identity and purpose. Modern societies offer freedom, but also confusion, choices, but also anxiety, autonomy, but also isolation. We can no longer simply inherit an identity. We must construct one. We can no longer simply follow the collective myths. We must find our own meaning. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying, and both Jung and Erikson were trying to help people navigate it. Jung's answer was individuation, the journey inward to find one's unique myth and meaning. This requires courage, the courage to face the unconscious, to confront one's shadow, to question collective values, to stand alone if necessary. But it also brings profound rewards, a sense of authenticity, of living one's own life rather than a borrowed or imposed one, of participating consciously in the eternal patterns that transcend individual existence. Erikson's answer was identity formation and psychosocial development, the journey through stages that build ego strength and connect the individual to the social world in meaningful ways. This requires commitment, the courage to pledge oneself to values and relationships and communities, even without absolute certainty, to build a coherent life narrative that makes sense of past, present, and future. The reward is a strong identity, the capacity for intimacy and generativity, the achievement of integrity and wisdom. Both journeys are necessary. Both answers are partial truths that complement each other. We need the inward journey to find authenticity and depth, to avoid losing ourselves in social roles and collective expectations. We need the outward journey to find connection and meaning, to avoid narcissistic isolation and spiritual inflation. The fully developed person has traveled both paths, has achieved both ego strength and self-realization, both social competence and symbolic wisdom. Let us consider what each man would say about some of the central questions of human existence. What is the self? For Jung, the self is multi-layered, consisting of a conscious ego, a personal unconscious containing repressed contents and complexes, and a collective unconscious containing archetypal patterns. The self, with a capital S, is the archetype of wholeness, the organizing principle of the psyche, both center and circumference. The ego is not the whole personality, but only the center of consciousness, and individuation involves the ego coming into right relationship with the larger self. For Erikson, the self is primarily ego identity, the sense of continuity and sameness that links one's experience across time and contexts. Identity is constructed through interactions with the social world, through choices and commitments, through the progressive resolution of psychosocial crises. The self is coherent, narrative, social, built from identifications and relationships and roles. While Erikson acknowledged unconscious processes, his focus was on the ego and its development rather than on the unconscious and its depths. What is the purpose of human life? Jung would say that the purpose is individuation, becoming who you truly are by integrating unconscious contents and realizing your unique pattern of wholeness. This is a spiritual journey, a secular pilgrimage towards self-knowledge and self-realization. The individuated person contributes to the collective, not by conforming but by being uniquely themselves, by adding their particular voice to the human chorus, by living their myth fully and consciously. Erikson would say that the purpose is to develop ego strength through the resolution of psychosocial crises, to form a strong identity, to love and work productively, to contribute to the next generation, to achieve integrity and wisdom. This is a social journey, a path of increasing connection and contribution that links individual development to the continuity of society and culture. The mature person contributes by being generative, by passing on what they have learned, by mentoring and teaching and creating and caring. What causes psychological suffering? Jung would point to one-sidedness, to identification with the persona, to the repression of shadow contents, to the loss of connection with the symbolic life. Neurosis arises when the ego is too rigid, when it tries to maintain a one-sided attitude that the psyche as a whole cannot support. The cure is dialogue with the unconscious, integration of split-off contents, the acceptance of paradox, and the embrace of symbolic transformation. In Jung's view, many modern neuroses stem from the loss of living religious symbols, the death of myth, the rationalization and disenchantment of the world. Erikson would point to developmental crises, unresolved or poorly resolved, to identity confusion, to the lack of ego strength needed for the challenges of each life stage. Suffering arises when basic trust is not established in infancy, when autonomy is crushed by shame, when guilt stifles initiative, when feelings of inferiority block competence, when identity remains diffused, when intimacy is foreclosed, when generativity gives way to stagnation, when despair overwhelms the possibility of integrity. The cure is developmental, providing the support and experiences needed to resolve the current crisis and strengthen the ego for future challenges. What is the relationship between individual and society? Jung held this in tension, recognizing that we need some degree of social adaptation to survive, but warning against over-identification with collective values. The individuated person may sometimes need to stand against the collective, to refuse to go along with collective madness or meaninglessness. Society provides the context for development, but can also be a source of oppression, demanding conformity at the expense of individuality. The relationship between individual and collective is dialectical, each needing the other, but also potentially in conflict. Erikson saw individual and society as fundamentally interdependent, mutually shaping each other. Identity is always psychosocial, formed in the interaction between biological potential and social expectation. Healthy societies support healthy development by providing appropriate structures and supports at each life stage. Healthy individuals contribute to healthy societies by being productive, generative, and wise. The relationship is not antagonistic, but synergistic when functioning well. Though Erikson acknowledged that social pathology can create impossible developmental challenges. How does change happen? Jung emphasized the symbolic function, the psyche's ability to create new symbols that transcend the conflict between conscious and unconscious, between opposing attitudes. Change happens through the compensatory activity of the unconscious, through dreams that correct one-sided conscious attitudes, through encounters with archetypal figures that bring new energy and perspective. The transcendent function creates a third thing, a symbol that is neither one pole nor the other, but something new that contains and transcends both. This is a natural process, but it can be facilitated by analysis, by active imagination, by creative work, by attention to the symbolic life. Erikson emphasized the resolution of psychosocial crises through new relationships, new challenges, new social supports. Change happens when developmental challenges are met with adequate resources, when the young person finds mentors and communities that support identity exploration, when the adult finds meaningful work and relationships, when the elder finds opportunities to pass on wisdom. This is also a natural process, following the epigenetic principle, where each stage emerges in sequence, but it can be facilitated by therapy, education, social policy, and cultural reform. What is the relationship between past, present, and future? Jung saw time as less linear than Erikson did. The archetypes are eternal, existing outside time, even as they manifest in particular historical moments. The unconscious does not follow chronological time. In dreams, past and future intermingle, and the psyche operates according to its own symbolic logic. Individuation involves integrating the personal past, childhood experiences, and complexes, but also connecting with the timeless dimension of the collective unconscious. The self pulls us toward the future, toward our potential wholeness, even as it contains all of our past. Erikson saw development as fundamentally temporal, as a sequence of stages that build on each other across the lifespan. Identity involves integrating past identifications into a coherent, present sense of self that projects into an imagined future. We understand who we are by understanding where we have come from and where we are going. Life review in old age involves making narrative sense of the entire temporal arc, seeing the life cycle as a meaningful whole. The past shapes the present through carryover of unresolved crises, and the present shapes the future through the ego strengths we build. As you sink deeper into rest, breathing slowly, let these different perspectives wash over you without trying to grasp them too firmly. Perhaps what Jung and Erikson revealed together is that human development is richer and more complex than any single framework can capture. We develop both inward and outward, both in depth and in time, both symbolically and socially. We are both unique individuals on our own paths and social beings embedded in relationships and cultures. We carry both timeless archetypal patterns and particular historical experiences. We need both the ego strength to navigate our social world and the wisdom to connect with something beyond the ego. Their dialogue, whether actual or imagined, whether occurring in conversation or across the distance of their different frameworks, enriches our understanding of what it means to be human. Where Jung might see an encounter with the shadow, Erikson might see the resolution of identity crisis. Where Erikson might see generativity, Jung might see the natural movement of the individuating psyche toward wholeness and contribution. Where Jung might see a symbolic death and rebirth, Erikson might see the transition from one life stage to another. They are describing the same territories of human experience from different vantage points, using different languages, emphasizing different aspects. Modern developmental psychology has largely followed Erikson's path, focusing on measurable stages, observable behaviors, and social contexts. His framework has been enormously influential, shaping how we think about childhood, development, adolescent identity, adult maturity, and aging. His concepts have entered the broader culture. We speak of identity crises, of role confusion, of midlife generativity, using his language even when we don't know its source. Jung's influence has been different. less within academic psychology and more within depth psychology, psychotherapy, and the broader culture's engagement with spirituality, mythology, and meaning. His ideas about archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, and the self have inspired artists, writers, theologians, and seekers of all kinds. His emphasis on the symbolic life, on dreams and imagination, on the spiritual dimension of the psyche, has kept alive a vision of psychology as something more than behavior modification or symptom reduction. Perhaps what we need now, in our current moment of multiple crises, of technological transformation, environmental catastrophe, political polarization, and spiritual seeking, is a synthesis of these visions. We need Erikson's attention to social structures and life stages to understand how to support healthy development in a rapidly changing world. How do we help children develop trust in an era of instability? How do we support identity formation when traditional structures have collapsed? How do we enable generativity when the future itself seems uncertain? How do we achieve integrity when the narratives that once gave life meaning have fragmented? And we need Jung's attention to symbolic depth and individuation to help people find meaning beyond social roles and material success. How do we connect with the timeless patterns that give life depth and resonance? How do we face the shadow, both personal and collective? How do we find our unique myth when collective myths no longer hold? How do we prepare for death in a culture that denies it? The conversation between Jung and Erikson, then, is not merely historical, but ongoing, a dialogue that continues in every therapy session, every life transition, every moment when we ask who we are and what our life means. They offer complementary maps of the same territory, and we are fortunate to have both available to us as we navigate our own journeys. Let us return once more to the beginning, to the young Carl Jung in the Berg-Holzli Hospital and the child Erich Homburger in Frankfurt, two souls who would spend their lives trying to understand the great mystery of human development. Neither could have known how their work would interweave, how their different perspectives would illuminate the same fundamental questions. Jung, following his visions and dreams into the collective unconscious, discovering archetypal patterns that connect us to all of humanity. Erikson, following his questions about identity across cultures and lifespans, discovering psychosocial patterns that connect individuals to their communities and times. They both experience displacement and transformation in their own lives. Jung's break with Freud was a kind of death and rebirth, a shattering of his professional identity and security that led to his deepest discoveries. Erikson's emigration from Europe to America, his transformation from Erich Homburger to Erik Erikson, was a literal reinvention of identity that surely informed his theoretical insights. Both men knew from personal experience that development is never simply smooth and linear, that it involves crises, disruptions, dark nights of the soul that can lead, if navigated well, to new levels of integration and wisdom. Both men lived long lives, continuing to work and write into old age. Jung died in 1961 at age 85, having spent his final years writing, painting, and working on his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Erikson died in 1994 at age 91, having continued to revise and expand his theory until the end, adding a ninth stage in collaboration with his wife Joan that addressed the challenges of very old age. Both exemplified in their own lives the continuing development they theorized, remaining creative, generative, and reflective until death. Imagine them now, these two giants of psychology, not as abstract theorists, but as human beings who suffered and struggled and sought, who faced their own shadows and identities, who grappled with meaning in a seemingly meaningless world. Jung, with his visions and his red book, his stone tower at Bollingen where he went to be alone with the unconscious, his final years spent in reflection on alchemy and the relationship between psyche and matter. Erikson, with his fieldwork among the Sioux and Yurok, his studies of Luther and Gandhi, his attempts to bridge psychoanalysis and anthropology, his final years spent considering very old age and the balance of integrity against despair. They both understood, deeply, that we are not finished products but works in progress, not static beings but dynamic processes, not isolated monads but parts of larger wholes. We are always becoming, always developing, always facing new challenges that call forth new capacities. This process continues from birth to death, and perhaps beyond, if Jung was right about the psyche's preparation for transformation rather than mere ending. The dialogue between their visions is ultimately a dialogue about what it means to be fully human, to realize our potential, to live with depth and meaning and connection. Jung reminds us that we are more than our social roles, that within us are depths that connect to eternal patterns and meanings, that the journey inward is as important as the journey outward. Erikson reminds us that we are fundamentally social beings, that we develop through relationship and context, that the journey outward into engagement with others and culture is essential to becoming who we are. Together, they offer a vision of development that is both deep and wide, both timeless and temporal, both individual and collective, to individuate in Jung's sense, while also developing ego strength through Erikson's stages, to integrate the unconscious while also resolving psychosocial crises, to find one's unique myth while also contributing to one's community and culture. This is the full challenge and opportunity of human development. As you drift now into sleep, let these ideas settle into the deeper layers of consciousness, becoming part of your own process of development and individuation. You are walking your own unique path, facing your own crises and transformations, integrating your own shadows and potentials. You are both the hero of your own story, as Jung might say, and the protagonist in a psychosocial narrative, as Erikson might frame it. You are discovering who you are through encounters with the unconscious and through engagement with the social world. You are becoming yourself, uniquely individual, yet expressing universal patterns, solitary, yet connected, in time, yet touching the timeless. The work of Jung and Erikson continues in you, in every person who asks, "Who am I? And what is my life for?" Their theories are not dusty academic relics, but living maps that can guide us through the challenges of contemporary existence. When you face a crisis, whether psychological or social, whether internal or external, you can ask both, what archetypal pattern is constellating here? And what developmental challenge am I facing? When you feel lost or confused about your direction, you can look both inward to dreams and symbols for guidance from the self, and outward to relationships and communities for support in identity formation. When you seek meaning, you can explore both the timeless myths and symbols that resonate with your soul, and the particular narrative of your life within its historical and cultural context. The conversation between these two great minds echoes in the consulting rooms of therapists, in the reflections of artists and writers, in the questions of seekers and students, in the lives of anyone trying to understand themselves and live authentically. It is a conversation that will continue as long as human beings wonder about their nature, their purpose, their development across the lifespan. It is a conversation that you join whenever you reflect on your own growth, your own challenges, your own journey toward wholeness and integrity. And so we come to the end of this night's journey through the parallel and divergent paths of Carl Jung and Erik Erikson. Two men who never sat in sustained dialogue, but whose work speaks to each other across disciplines and decades. Two maps of the same territory, each revealing features that the other might miss, each valuable in its own way, each more complete when considered alongside the other. Two visions of human development, one looking inward to the eternal patterns of the collective unconscious, the other looking outward to the social contexts that shape identity, yet both recognizing that we are called to become more than we are, to develop throughout life, to face crises and integrate them, to achieve some form of wholeness before we die. May their wisdom accompany you on your own journey. May their insights illuminate your path. May their compassion for human suffering and human potential inspire your own work of becoming. You are both individuating and developing identity, both confronting archetypes and resolving psychosocial crises, both discovering your unique myth and building your life narrative. You are walking the path that they mapped from their different perspectives, a path that is both ancient and new, both yours alone and shared by all humanity. Rest now, dreamer, wanderer, seeker. Let sleep carry you into the unconscious realm where symbols speak and transformations occur. Let tomorrow bring new opportunities for development and individuation, for relationship and authenticity, for ego strength and self-realization. The work continues. The journey unfolds. The mystery deepens. And in that mysterious unfolding lies both the challenge and the gift of being human, of being conscious, of being called to become who we truly are. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Jung and Erikson, these two profound students of human development and transformation. May their dialogue continue in your own reflections, your own dreams, your own journey through the stages and symbols of a fully lived life. Good night and gentle dreams.